Hello, listeners. This is Roy Damari of Insam with his weekly ramblings, and they will cover this week both the latest developments over the Iran sanctions and the European reaction to the US approach, and then I will bring you more up to date on the enfolding saga for me of how the East was won, meaning Russia as distinct from the American West. Now, a few weeks ago, I bemoaned the fact that I learned from my banker, my Swiss banker, that America, in some sense, could look at all that I was doing. And I felt this was an extension of American hegemony beyond a point where I was at all happy about it. I don't have anything to hide, but I object to one particular country taking upon itself the possibility of controlling the actions of citizens outside its own realm. Now, this idea that the USA can impose its will on the world and abuse its position of power has come to the fore in a big way over the breaking, or the reneging is the correct word, of Trump of the deal with Iran to prevent them developing nuclear weapons. Because what has happened is that he's saying, not only will I renege on a signed international agreement, but he's going to impose sanctions on the other signatories of that agreement who have absolutely no reason whatsoever to break it, and that includes Iran itself and all the other countries in Western Europe and in Russia and China who are perfectly happy with the agreement and very glad that they can continue with Iran to let Iran become a normal country again without nuclear weapons. Now, putting it mildly, it's pretty obvious that Donald Trump is what we used to call at school a simple bully. He's a bully. He wants to impose his will on other people without discussion. Now, a more sensitive word than that has been used by Donald Tusk of the European Union recently, in which he refers to the decision by Trump to renege on the Iran deal as capricious assertiveness. I must admit that expression is a little bit classier than my simply saying, he's a bully. Now, we all know the standard reaction to bullying. You either give in or you stand up to it. And standing up to it is very difficult because the bully in question is extremely powerful. And he has managed to bring a lot of his people with him in his bullying tactics. However, there is finally a degree of courage developing in Europe, and that even includes the United Kingdom, with Theresa May also being part of a meeting taking place, I think, as I record, in Bulgaria, in which they discuss how the other signatories of the Iran deal can continue to encourage that country to return to the fold of civilized nations. Actually, I think it's extremely bad for the US economy to renege on this deal with Iran anyway, but we can't, as it were, comment too much on whether it is right or wrong for the US administration to impose conditions on the US economy and the nation as a whole, which are actually deleterious to the economic health and well-being of the people. That's their problem. We can point it out to them, but that's all we can do. But for the rest of the world, there is a definite case now of saying enough is enough. We do not intend just to kowtow to a bully running the United States. Now, the techniques that the United States will use to punish people who dare stand up to it and actually respect the deal with Iran would have various possibilities. They include fines, they include forbidding a company to do business in the USA, and what they call the nuclear option, which would be to close access to the financial system based on the dollar for international settlements. And that is really bad news for anybody who wants to do international trade. Those are the three threats, and the way to stand up to them is partly to act together as a group, not try and fight individually, but for the countries to get together and say, no, we are not going to give up on this. And the other is for companies to say, okay, well, then we will do without the US market for whatever our services or products are, and continue to trade with the rest of the world, which would include Iran. Now, that might be fine for companies that can kiss goodbye to the US market, who may never have been in there in the first place. But for large companies where the United States is an important market and partner, it's not so obvious. A possible solution, which has been suggested in the FT on the day I make this broadcast, is that large companies will float off independent companies in order to trade freely without the American hegemony. There is, however, a much more important long-term impact of the Trump capriciousness. It is that the very system on which the world is based for its trading, dollar-based, and which Alan Greenspan actually called an exorbitant advantage, that system, if it's not reliable, is bound to lead to people creating another independent system of it, built round probably the euro, which is the next biggest currency after the United States dollar. So careful what you do. If you've got a system, you've got an exorbitant advantage, but then you abuse that advantage, in the end, alternatives will develop. And that, to me, is the long-term impact of the capricious assertiveness, as Donald Tusk describes it. In the end, the Iran deal may have very positive longer-term impact in that at last the world becomes a bit more self-determining rather than allowing itself to be subject to a very unnecessary US hegemony. None of which says, by the way, anything other than I love Americans, I love America, I just have a bit of a problem with the chap in charge at present. Let me change subjects totally in my ramblings to return to how the East was won, and the curious fact that the eastern part of Russia for Europeans was kind of discovered because of their search for China. At the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, West European trading nations, particularly England, but also Holland, to a much lesser extent Spain, which had, of course, its colonies in South America, these countries wanted to find a way to China. And they were looking for it by going west, looking for the Northwest Passage, which has been opened only recently at long last, but because of horrible reasons like the climate change. And they were convinced that there should be a Northeast Passage round the top of Norway and across the top of Russia and keep going, and you'd finally come either to China itself. No, they didn't really expect that, but they found big rivers which would go south into China. And so they pushed further and further east across the Arctic Ocean. And the Dutch and the English were the most persistent. Some of the Dutch people were actually refugees from anti-Huguenot France, and they did quite well, but lost a lot of people and lost a lot of boats as well. And the idea was always to go to Moscow in the end by landing at Arkhangelsk, as I pronounce it, might be slightly wrong, and those people would then trade with Moscow and with Ivan. Now, they were bullies. I've used the word bully a lot in this broadcast, and England certainly, with its imperial status and its great navy, acted in a bullying way. And they thought they could bully things with Ivan the Terrible. It didn't work. So in 1583, Elizabeth I sent a certain Sir Jerome Bowes as an emissary to go and do a deal with Ivan. But Ivan was actually getting close to his deathbed and got very angry and basically stopped the whole process of West European powers going round the top and landing on the northern shores of Russia. So in the end, this this whole episode of opening up Russia to the west via the north, which is curious, isn't it? And based on trading of the saber furs and things like that, that all came to a grinding halt. Besides that, once Ivan the Terrible had died with these various interdictions, the Boris Godunov period started, which they call the times of trouble, and Russia was in an awful mess until the Romanovs came along a little later. In fact, there was even a plan, which is described in the book I'm summarizing to you, to invade, for the Western European powers to invade Russia and take it over. They didn't try, of course, and they would have failed just in the same way as Napoleon and Hitler have failed. But it's interesting to know the idea that, well, we've had enough of Russia, we'll invade it. Crazy idea, but that was a serious plan at the end of the 16th century. But we'll see how things develop as the Russians themselves, never mind the Western powers, got across the Ural. Remember, they're chasing the saber, and they will move further and further eastwards into Siberia, ending up, and this is intriguing, they end up in Alaska and then had to give up Alaska because it was too far away and too expensive to maintain. So more next week.